Hello everyone. In this video I'm going to talk a little bit about the limitations permitted by the human rights law, because not all human rights principles enjoy the same level of protection. Instead, they can have different legal characteristics, being absolute or non-absolute in nature, or having inherent limitations. Some of the most fundamental human rights are absolute. Such rights include the prohibitions on torture, on slavery, and on retroactive criminal laws. The absolute character of these rights means that it is not permitted to restrict these rights by balancing their enjoyment against the pursuit of a legitimate aim. For example, Article 2 of the Convention Against Torture and Other Cruel, Inhumane, or Degrading Treatment or Punishment provides that no exceptional circumstances whatsoever, whether a state of war or a threat of war, internal political instability, or any other public emergency, may be invoked as a justification of torture. Similarly, in response to the practice of some states, the Human Rights Committee has stated that the prohibitions against the taking of hostages, abductions, or unacknowledged detention are not subject to derogation. The absolute nature of these prohibitions, even in times of emergency, is justified by their status as norms of general international law. Most rights, however, are not absolute in character. States can limit the exercise of these rights for valid reasons, including the need of countering terrorism, as long as they respect a number of conditions. In the case of some rights, the conditions of legitimate limitations are spelled out in the treaty provisions enshrining the right. Examples are the right to freedom of expression, freedom of association, freedom of assembly, and freedom of movement, and the requirement of publicity of court hearings. These rights are accompanied by various grounds, such as national security or public order, as well as conditions to be met in order for them to be legitimately limited. Notably, the restrictions provided for in the text, such as in Article 18 and 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, exists and may be relied upon independently of any declaration of a state of emergency. Indeed, even in times of public emergencies, as understood in Article 4 of the ICCPR, states may elect to rely upon these restrictions instead of seeking derogations. In the case of some other rights, the Human Rights Treaty provision limits itself to stating that the right may not be interfered with arbitrarily. This is, for instance, the case of Article 9, which requires that deprivation of liberty must not be arbitrary. The notion of arbitrariness is not to be equated with against the law, but must be interpreted more broadly to include elements of inappropriateness, injustice, lack of predictability, and due process of law. The conditions for legitimate limitation of non-absolute rights without derogation. On the basis of provision such as Article 19 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, protecting the right of freedom of expression. Other examples included are Articles 18, 21, and 22. The human rights courts and treaty bodies have developed a test to establish whether a measure limiting a non-absolute right is legitimate. The following questions must be asked. Is there a legal basis for the measure limiting the right? Does the limitation on the right pursue a legitimate aim, such as respect of the rights or reputations of others, the protection of national security, the maintenance of public order, or public health or morals? If so, is the limitation necessary to achieve the legitimate aim, and is the extent of the limitation proportionate in pursuit of the identified legitimate aim? The existence and effectiveness of procedural safeguards will be the key aspect of the assessment whether the limitation of the right is proportionate. And does the restriction respect the principle of equality? Is it non-discriminatory? Measures that limits rights in a discriminatory way will fail the test of proportionality. Therefore, the question of discrimination is generally considered one aspect of the necessity and proportionality test. Only if all of these questions can be answered in the affirmative in a specific case will a restriction on a non-absolute right be permissible under international human rights law. Note that this test was developed to examine the permissibility of measures interfering with the rights, explicitly permitting restrictions and spelling out the legitimate aims justifying restrictions. However, very similar reasoning is in fact used to assess whether measures limiting other non-absolute rights are permissible. An example is that detention will be considered arbitrary not only if it is devoid of a legal basis, but also if it is discriminatory or completely disproportionate to the legitimate aim to be achieved. Finally, some rights are subject to what could be termed inherent limitations. The right of an accused person is a criminal case to be tried without undue delay, is an example. What is a reasonable delay is to be assessed in the circumstances of each case, taking into account the complexity of the case, which in terrorism cases may be considerable. The conduct of the accused and the manner in which the matter was dealt with by the investigating and judicial authorities. These limitations are not articulated in the text of human rights treaties, rather have been developed by national and international courts and other treaty monitoring bodies applying human rights norms to specific cases before them. I know that was a lot, but when we look at human rights, everybody always says, this is my right, this is your right. I stand with you for your rights, you stand with me for my rights. But we never really think about the limitations that is put on it. The government kind, you know, the government kind of gave us our rights, but they didn't give us our rights. We have our rights because we were born human. But when society looks at it, the government has so much to do with our rights that it appears as though they gave us our rights. Now, when looking into a lot of this human rights stuff, I have came across a lot of stuff about criminal law and the way that things appear versus the way that they really are. And, you get into all the terrorism, the counterterrorism, you get into like murders and rapes and different things where you have higher courts, longer trials, the placement for the prison, whether you're in a restricted area, you're in confinement, you're in solitary. There's a lot to look at when it comes to that as well. Being in a prison, you lose a lot of your basic human rights. But I've also seen a lot of prisons, and I know for a fact the one that Lorenzo Gilliard was in when before I helped him get moved to another one. Actually, by helping him get moved to another one, I pretty much helped get the whole prison moved over. But the treatment in there was so bad that it literally went against the majority of the human rights. But as a prisoner, no one wanted to stand up against the system. No one wanted to call out the treatment. And that's a lot of what these articles are talking about with the due process. And even after having years upon years in prison, a lot of time the prisoners end up just kind of going with the flow. Like they get so used to the mistreatment that we on the outside hear about the way they are treated, and we can see the violations, but they have been conforming to it for so long that they have literally forgotten what their basic human rights are. And that's part of the system that needs to change. And on those questions that they ask, or supposed to ask anyway, I mean, any answer can be given. If I think something goes against a human rights, but another person doesn't, then does it or doesn't it? They can answer those questions in any way to get to the answer that they want. As I said in the other video, this is a very deep hole, and I will be covering in other videos specific treatments of prisoners and others in detainment, as well as everyday citizens. If you have ever been discriminated against for your basic human rights, comment below, because at some point I do want to do a live to discuss this. I'm not exactly sure when my signal and the Wi-Fi strength will hold up to do a live, but that is something that I do want to do because I want to do a deep dive into this. And in another video, I'm also going to be talking about ways to ensure that the loved ones that you have that are being detained in prison are being treated as human and given their rights, and ways that you can ensure that the prison itself knows that that inmate is not alone, and that there are others who are watching the treatment that is going on within that prison. Now, I know that these articles and stuff that I have read off, um, it goes deeper than just prisons. It's talking about war crimes and political warfare and all kinds of stuff. But right now I'm talking about just prisons because I have heard so many stories from so many different prisons, and half the time after they spent 10, 20 years in prison, they don't even know what their human rights are anymore because they have been violated so many times. So that is kind of a direction that I am taking this series into, although it will be spiraling into a whole bunch of different areas as well. But it's getting late, so I'm about to head in and I will talk to you all soon. Have a good night.